Welcome to the Saltier Politics podcast. I'm Julie Roginsky, along with Emily, and we have Matt Katz, the immigration reporter for WNYC and NPR, in the studio with us today. Emily, we had a great talk with Matt, and the thing that surprised me most about this conversation, we veered a little bit off the rails in a great way, is that Matt, who's this really accomplished immigration reporter, started out writing a dating column. He was sort of the Carrie Bradshaw of suburban New Jersey, turns out. And we delve a little bit into that on the podcast as well.
I know. I was surprised by it a lot, and I learned not only about Matt and being the first Carrie Bradshaw, but also his New Jersey politics stuff, which you and him really talked a lot about.
Yeah, we kind of geeked out on the Chris Christie stuff a little bit because he wrote a book about Chris Christie, which we'll delve into as well. It was great to talk to somebody who's actually an expert in the immigration field and being able to sort of separate the myth from the reality of what's going on with this caravan, what's going on with family separations, what's going on at the border by somebody and with somebody who actually covers this, has visited some of these places, and certainly has an expert opinion, and not an opinion, expert view on what's going on, which is very different from a lot of the things that you see and hear in media these days.
Before also, I would like to say that he did make you drink a brown alcohol. We had to make Manhattans for this, and that was an experience in itself.
That's true, because I have actually not had a sip of any brown alcohol since I was 16 years old and got into a very unfortunate drinking contest with somebody who's probably around 200 pounds back in high school. That guy now is a pretty high up guy at the Justice Department, so I'll leave his name out of the equation other than to say, kids, don't ever, ever, ever accept a challenge to drink as many shots of Old Crow as you can. You'll end up like me, basically hating bourbon, rye, and whiskey for the rest of your life.
Yep, so pretty much when he sent the email saying his favorite drink is a Manhattan, I knew we were in for quite a ride, and I think the listeners will be too.
Yeah, I womaned up. I had a few sips. I didn't pass out. It was okay. Anyway, we're coming up with Matt Katz. Looking forward to that discussion with him.
Matt Katz, welcome to Saltier Politics. Full disclosure, we did spill a Manhattan before this.
That's true.
Who's we?
Well, I Julie spilled a Manhattan. It's actually as a protest against all bourbon, rye, and whiskey type products. But unfortunately, somebody just made me a second one. So welcome, Matt Katz.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Matt Katz, an immigration reporter for WNYC here in New York and NPR nationally. Also author.
American Governor.
Thank
Chris
you.
Christie's Bridge to Redemption.
Matt, thank you so much for coming. Before we get into Chris Christie and his future, if he has one, I want to talk about immigration because it is a week or less than a week before the election. Mm-hmm. And it seems like the president has decided that it's going to come down to getting out his base, and the way he thinks he's going to get the base out is to talk about this caravan of disease and smallpox infested foreigners who are descending upon our southern border. And tell us, first and foremost, where this caravan is. My understanding is it's about 1,000 miles away and they're walking.
Right. Less than a week out from the election, it is the equivalent of South Florida to New York, and they're all walking.
Right.
So it's going to be many weeks for them to make it to the U.S. border, and once they do, their numbers will likely have dwindled.
We've seen this caravan type of thing before, right?
Oh, sure. They're periodically caravans. They travel in caravans for safety. It's a typical way that people from the Northern Triangle of Central America will come up to the border.
So why don't you tell people, because I'm not sure people have a clear understanding of who is in this caravan. Who are these people, and what's the demographic? Is it families? Is it ISIS, as Donald Trump and some of his supporters claim? Is it people fleeing rape and poverty and murder, as you said in the Triangle?
Right. I have not been down there, but from all reporting, there are no Middle Easterners. It is all Central Americans. The president says that there could be Middle Easterners in there, as do other Republicans. There are children. A baby was born along the caravan as it was coming up. There's also obviously a lot of young men, but it is impossible to know what their criminal record would be or their affiliation with MS-13 if such a thing might exist. There's no way the president would have any idea about that. I mean, generally speaking, the people that are fleeing Central America are doing so because of extortion, because of gangs that run large swaths of those countries, and they're fleeing because of some of it's purely economic. They're looking for opportunity. And once they get into the country, statistics show that immigrants are not more likely to be criminals than the native-born Americans. But they present a concern for people, and that's what Republicans are running on.
And why are they fleeing? I mean, what's their raison d'etre? Why are they leaving their countries?
I mean, there's various reasons, but under under international asylum law, and they can leave because they're leaving because they say they are a persecuted group or are part of a persecuted social class. So some of them are women who have been raped by gang members. Some of them are men who have been extorted by gangs, and their family members have been killed by gangs, and they're fleeing for safety. Then there's other economic reasons. They can't find work, and they have to support their family, and they have relatives in the United States, and they've been told they can have opportunity here. So those are the reasons. And I've spoken to people who've been there aren't protections for gay people, and traditionally we have in the U.S. admitted gays under asylum law, and there are certainly people who are leaving because they're not they're either persecuted because of their homosexuality, or they've been they're persecuted and they're not protected by the government. Like the police, I've been told, don't investigate any sort of hate crime against gay people. So those are the various reasons. But there's people also that sometimes come up from the southern border, and we don't know if there's any in the caravan now, who are from elsewhere. I mean, I interviewed a guy who is from Eritrea, and he had been a journalist, and he wrote something that got himself in trouble, and he flew to 2 other African countries, couldn't find work, ended up flying to Brazil, and then he made his way all the way up from Brazil, all the way through Central America to the U.S.-Mexico border, and then found himself detained in New Jersey. They sent him over to New Jersey to be detained. So you do get other people from elsewhere around the world who come up via the southern border. But there's no indication that there's ISIS people in this caravan right now.
So 15,000 troops is just an appropriate response, naturally, to people fleeing for their lives.
It's unclear what these troops can really even do. I mean, these are not people who are looking to fight anybody. In fact, they are mostly looking to find an American official so they can declare asylum, because under U.S. and international law, if someone comes up to a U.S. official, a border official, and says, I'm here to declare asylum, they pass a brief interview process that indicates they have a credible fear, and then they're allowed to stay in the country pending a full immigration hearing and investigation. So they're not looking to invade. They are just looking to come in and come to the border and declare asylum, which is supposed to be technically legal.
What's interesting to me about all of this is I think there's some fear among the president's supporters. This is some sort of White Walker, Game of Thrones, let's storm the wall, and just overwhelm humanity here in the States. But in reality, I think from previous caravans, isn't it something like 90% of the people will not reach the border, and of the people who do, about 90% of them will be deported back, right? I mean, it's a very small amount that's going to end up staying here and getting asylum, even if they merit it.
Right, and they're not going to, and the numbers that could stay here and then go through the lengthy process to become citizens and then register to vote as Democrats, which is also the concern, that they're coming in to vote as Democrats and tip elections. That's also would be very far off as well.
And by the time they do, I think Barron Trump might be running for president, because it's certainly not going to happen any time that Donald Trump in 2020 will be running for re-election.
Right.
So aside from that, it just seems to me that how did it happen that immigration has become such a major issue? And you did a very interesting story I saw using New Jersey as an example of Democrats in New Jersey, not in swing districts, not really talking about immigration, but Republicans in swing districts really doubling down on it. How did it become such an issue to avoid for Democrats? I get for Republicans why it's such an issue. The president has talked about it nonstop, and it's become something that's really galvanizing the base. But how is it that Democrats have not been able to explain their position on this in an effective way politically?
It's unclear if they really have a position. I mean, traditionally, Democrats have not necessarily been any more pro-immigrants than Republicans. So the law currently that Trump is mostly enforcing to a certain degree. I mean, if you've committed a crime and you're not a citizen and you got possession of cocaine, let's say 15 years ago, but you're a legal permanent resident, you have your papers, you can be now arrested. That you're allowed to. that's allowed to happen. Trump is enforcing, no one ever actually went after those people, but now Trump is going after those people. Those laws were passed by Democratic Congresses. I mean, we didn't, the law in 1996 was signed by Bill Clinton with a Republican Congress. But that law, signed by Bill Clinton, essentially created the immigration detention system where there's several hundreds of thousands of immigrants in right now. We didn't used to detain immigrants. The whole idea of criminalizing not having your documents was due to a law signed by Bill Clinton. Then the years go on, the immigration system gets more confusing, murkier, more and more undocumented people living in the country, and new Americans and immigrants watch as Democrats didn't really do anything to fix it. They watched as Obama had increased deportations to a significant degree, and then there's now, and you would think. And it seems that given the overheated rhetoric about immigrants, the racism that comes out of the White House about immigrants, that Democrats would stick up for this population. And you see some of it. You see the family separation. The Democrats held some rallies about that. But as we get closer to the midterms, it is clearly evident that Democratic support for immigrants is a mile wide and an inch deep. It does not go very far. So you have candidates running in swing districts in New Jersey and elsewhere in the country who don't even list immigration on their websites. And what's so crazy about that is this is clearly the most talked about controversial issue in America because the president has made it so. And the ways he's changed the law in the immigration realm is more significant than any other ways he's changed law in America. But the Democrats are, Mikey Sherrill is one candidate who's running for Congress in a swing district in New Jersey. She's a Democrat, and she's filling a seat that was held by a Republican in a district that Trump barely won. She does not talk about immigration, doesn't use the word immigration on her website, doesn't even mention Dreamers. I mean, these were broad public support for Dreamers, kids who were brought into the country as kids by their parents. They've never committed a crime. They're going to college. Obama created a pathway for citizenship for them, and Trump took it away. And you don't hear Democratic candidates running on this issue or forcing their Republican opponents to say anything about it, and then that allows their Republican opponents to then label them by being open borders Democrats or abolish ICE Democrats. And immigrant activists and new Americans are very upset by this. They don't understand why they can't get a political party to stick up for them in any way. Even if there's a family separation issue, they say the right things, but they're still kids separated from their parents. But Democratic candidates are not talking about it.
You raise a good point. I remember about 6 weeks, 2 months ago, it's all anybody talked about was family separation, and everybody was trying to get down to the border to see these little kids who literally had to go represent themselves in court. Right. A 2-year-old not speaking a word of English, and we're speaking any language for that matter at that age.
Right.
And then it seems like that kind of died down. And if you're Donald Trump, why not continue the policy? Eventually, people will lose interest, and eventually you could still do what you want to do. People are still separated, are they not? I mean, there are kids still in detention.
There are people still separated, kids still in foster care while their parents are in detention. They have not connected with their parents yet. There's a tent city that can house more than 3,500 kids at the border. That's for kids who come over without their parents. That's where they would go, but it could also be used whenever they want to continue this policy of separating asylum seeker children from their parents at the border. They could certainly do that again. Congress has not done anything to stop it, and it's operatives apparently, Democratic operatives are apparently telling Democratic candidates that voters really just care about healthcare and taxes and the economy, and that's what they should be running on, and not immigration. And Democratic candidates are also going for that. Center, this white center undecided voter who will not be sympathetic to the immigrants' cause and therefore don't talk about it, don't seem too pro-immigrant. Where others, the immigrant activists, say there's this whole swath of younger people, of people of color on the left who are not voting because they think there's no difference between the parties. And it's unclear why anybody would think a candidate who doesn't talk about immigration going into their election would actually talk about immigration or sponsor any legislation about immigration once they're in Congress.
It baffles me because, okay, the Republicans are taking the fear angle. I just don't see why more Democrats are going for the pathos, putting, this is a mom and a child. Every mother-child relationship transcends everything. It transcends party politics. So I just don't understand, and maybe you guys can elaborate for me, why I just don't see the Democrats just latch on to the Republicans got the fear. Why don't Dems go pathos and just mom and child being ripped apart?
Well, Matt and I actually talked about this, I think, a few days ago, but I think primarily, and it's a shame, and let me just distance myself from what I'm about to say because I don't believe it personally, but I think there is a sense, potentially, as Matt pointed out, among Democratic operatives or some Democratic operatives, not me, that these are not voters, that people who vote think about this hypothetically as a bad thing and a shame, but it's not their kids being taken away and separated. And when you contrast that with things that really do affect voters directly, like the Affordable Care Act being repealed or taxes being raised on the middle class or the lower class, working class voters, that's something that tangentially, immigration, I should say, something that tangentially affects voters because by nature they are not immigrants or they have the right to vote, or if they're immigrants, they're citizens now. But things like healthcare and things like taxes do very viscerally affect people. I say this as somebody who was an immigrant and was separated from my family at a very young age, not to see them again for a decade. The psychological toll that I think this kind of behavior takes on children, regardless of where those children end up growing up. They could all be deported back to Guatemala or Mexico or wherever they're coming from, or some of them can stay here. But I think the psychological toll, and take it from me as somebody who went through this, not in a detention without any family, but being taken away from my primary caregivers at the age of 6 for a decade, I will tell you, we are doing a massive disservice to these kids, and not just for the next few years, but really for the rest of their lives. That's my view.
But fear motivates people to the polls more than love does, right?
No question about it.
So that's why this is seen as a motivating issue for Republicans, and the counter to it, the pathos, is not. So you don't. It seems to me that for every commercial, like the MS-13 commercial that Trump tweeted about today, with showing a guy charged as an MS-13 member. For every one of those, you could see a counter from the Democrats of showing like the impact of family separation and the importance of reunifying families. But you don't see that. I haven't seen any Democratic candidate anywhere in the country do a family separation ad. Have you?
No, which is amazing considering that 6 weeks to 2 months ago, it literally drove the conversation on both sides.
Yes.
And to say that Trump has very effectively, I think, continued that narrative on his terms, and Democrats have completely walked away from the narrative that they were talking about,
Right.
To me is morally seeming to me like an abandonment of, first of all, these children who deserve much better. And for anybody listening who's going to suddenly say, well, they deserve it, they came here illegally, as Matt pointed out, they are coming here to get asylum. And the only way to do that is by presenting yourself at the border.
Right.
Also, they're children, and I think there's something about the sins of the father not being passed along to the sons and the daughters. But there's a lot to be said for the fact that I think the Democratic Party is doing a massive disservice to them.
I mean, there's just family separation is one of these issues where Democrats haven't talked about. I mean, refugee numbers are down to the lowest since the refugee program, the modern refugee program started in 1980. I mean, minuscule numbers. There were more refugees admitted after 9/11 than there are now. Refugees are people who actually apply while they're abroad to win the equivalent of asylum in the country, and they're more vetted than any other immigrants. So they're down. Those numbers have been slashed. There's temporary protected status for people from certain countries that suffered natural disasters and other calamities. That's been eliminated, although it's all tied up in the courts. The Muslim ban is basically still in effect. They just added a non-Muslim country to it, but it's still almost impossible to get here in any capacity if you're from Iran, for example. There have been DACA, the Dreamers. They are left in a lurch, unclear what's going on with them. There have been so many immigration policies that have been radically altered, and they are not a talking point at all. And when you hear Democrats talk about it, and this is what pisses off immigration activists more than anything, the first thing they say is we need secure borders. And that is considered an absolute red herring because most of the undocumented people in America just overstay their visas. They're already here. They're not like sneaking in. The borders are already strong. Also, there's never been a terrorist attack committed in the country by anybody who came in over the southern border. The only terrorist attack was committed by somebody who came in from the northern border.
And legally, I might add. I mean, they came in absolutely legally. Is there any Western country that has taken fewer refugees per capita than we have since the Syrian crisis began?
I mean, per capita, that's a great question. I mean, there's major economies that don't, not Western, like Japan, hardly takes any refugees.
Right.
But they compensate by giving the UN refugee program a ton of money. But their rhetoric is actually very interesting. I mean, they say they don't want to, they're a homogenous society, and they say straight up they just don't want any outsiders to change their culture and their ethnicity. And that's really the kind of the argument that now we're starting to hear here, even though it's obviously a much more heterogeneous population. But so you know, it's not like the argument, it's tough to make the argument that we're suddenly the most morally bankrupt country on earth. There are certainly other countries that do less even now for the stranger, that have the capacity to do more. But obviously what we're experiencing in America is also similar to what's going on elsewhere. I mean, there's issues all over Europe in terms of pushback against politicians who wanted to open their borders to some refugees. You're seeing that in Germany. You're seeing a pushback with the rise of the far right in Europe as well. So this is a worldwide phenomenon. I mean, there's this massive migration of people all over the globe now, more than we've ever seen in human history, because of just the nature of how easy it is to move, right? And connectivity and war and natural disasters. So there's movement of people. There's 67 million people displaced around the country, around the world. So this is and it's only going to grow and increase. So how countries deal with their borders and how they deal with, accepting immigrants and judging whether an immigrant deserves to be in their country is really, I think, going to be the story of our time and the story of the next generation.
We are going to move on to your book because my favorite topic of all time, Chris Christie, is on the table. But before we do that, tell people the one very interesting thing that they may not know about you, because I was kind of surprised when I heard it.
Were you surprised?
I was a little surprised.
I had a nationally syndicated dating column for several years.
For who?
So I was a reporter at the Courier Post in South Jersey,
right?
And it was for them, and then the Gannett, the parent company, newspaper company, syndicated it to first a few newspapers in New Jersey, and then all over the country to such metropolises as Battle Creek, Michigan.
So what qualified you, other than the fact that you're awesome and you're happily married, but what qualified you to talk to give women like me and Emily
I was not
dating
giving
advice?
I was not giving advice.
Okay.
In fact, somewhat of the opposite. I was writing it was a first person column about my own dating experiences and foibles.
So this is before you dated
Carrie Bradshaw?
When the people, even though I lived in a city, they would call it sex, and my newspaper was in the suburbs, so it was often joked that it was sex in the suburbs. And then when I eventually got married, in the New York Times did a little video and their vows thing, and they played of me and my wife, and they played the Sex and the City music.
So did your wife know this when she started dating you? Was
Yes.
this like a draw for her, that she was going to finally tame the guy that was doing the column?
I don't know if it was, there were these, I don't think it was a draw, but I feel like it did make me seem I was a little bit unique, I think. I had a billboard.
Wow.
And we were friends first, and she was a billboard in South Jersey. I had 3 billboards in South Jersey.
Amazing.
Did you have one on a bus? Did you watch it?
Right.
No, too right.
It said the billboard. The name of the column was called The Bachelor Pad. The billboard said, "Get a date with Matt Katz. Read The Bachelor Pad on Tuesdays." But so in the beginning, and for most of it, it was I would go to dating events. I joined weird dating websites. I had an imaginary girlfriend. There was a website called imaginarygirlfriend.com, and I paid $30, and I had an imaginary girlfriend in Saipan, which is in the Pacific, and we used to correspond, and I wrote about that a bunch. And then it turned out, this is the good twist, she was a dating columnist in Saipan, and then I wrote about that.
This sounds like a really bad rom-com where the two of you should end up together.
Right. Somebody sent me a check in the mail for $100 so I could because I wrote about how I couldn't afford the $2,000 plane ticket to meet her.
Oh my gosh.
I did not cash it, but I put it in my cubicle.
All right, let's talk about Chris Christie, which is somewhat as interesting, but not quite. You wrote this book about Chris Christie, and you wrote it while he was running for president, or at least I guess while he was gearing up to run for president. And I think at the time was seen as a front runner to potentially one of the front runners to be the Republican nominee. Bridgegate happened. I think he was still in fairly good shape even after Bridgegate happened. But then Donald Trump happened. And my question for you, somebody who knows Chris Christie, I think better than anybody else, is did Donald Trump kind of out Christie? Was Christie's whole persona kind of a much more downplayed Trump? Did Trump take that space that Christie otherwise would have occupied?
Absolutely. I mean, Bridgegate aside, Bridgegate might have given, Trump had said that he wouldn't have run at one point. I mean, you can't necessarily believe everything he says, but I mean, he had said at one point he wouldn't have run if it wasn't for Bridgegate. So obviously, and that hurt him in the long run. There were also other lower level scandals that were going on in New Jersey that started to bubble up as he was starting to run for president. But politically, he just had no space to run after this guy came in, because Christie's whole niche was he said whatever was on his mind. He gives it to you straight. He's not gonna, gloss over stuff. And then when you're then dealing with Trump, it's a whole other level of that. So whatever Christie would say, it would pale in comparison to Trump, and then Trump just filled the room. There was no other avenue for him, and it happened. And then, it was interesting. I thought of this when you were talking about immigration and how the party had shifted. I mean, Christie, when he was governor, won 51% of the Hispanic vote when he ran for re-election, and part of the reason is he allowed undocumented kids to go to in-state colleges to get in-state tuition, dreamers, which is like a remarkable thing for a Republican. And he was going to run as this sort of big tent Republican. He was going to run as the guy who he had appointed a Muslim judge in New Jersey, and then was criticized for it on the right for appointing a guy who was going to implement Sharia law. And then he went after those critics and said, I'm sick and tired of dealing with the crazies. And then he runs for president. Trump takes up all this space. He can't figure out his lane, and he ends up changing his positions, really. I mean, he then said that Syrian refugees, even 2-year-old orphan children, should be banned from coming into the country. He changed, while he was still governor and running, he pulled New Jersey out of the refugee resettlement business, so New Jersey would have no role in resettling refugees. He tried to out Trump, and obviously that didn't work either. He just became less and less popular in New Jersey.
I'm going to tell you a story from 2012, and you tell me whether you think this makes sense or not. The story is true, but tell me if you agree with the analysis. So election night 2012, I am sitting in the Fox green room, and if you remember, that was the night that Megyn Kelly did her famous walk to the brain room because Karl Rove was freaking out on air that Ohio had come in or Fox had declared Ohio coming in for Obama, and Rove disputed it. So as that's going on, waiting in the green room to go on, are Tucker Carlson, Laura Ingraham, neither of whom had primetime shows at Fox back then, and me. And as soon as it became apparent that Chris Christie won the election, that Barack Obama won the election, Laura Ingraham or Tucker Carlson, I forgot which one, said, this is due in large part to Chris Christie. And I said, that's strange. I'm from New Jersey. I don't know what Chris Christie had to do with this. And they were basically saying, I can't remember which one it was, but they were basically saying that it's because Christie hugged, which he actually had not, but had in their mind, and in their minds, a lot of people hugged Barack Obama right after Sandy, and he didn't need to do that, and he didn't need to cozy up to President Obama at the time, and that had cost Mitt Romney the election because suddenly Obama looked like a leader and a bipartisan leader at a time of crisis, which Sandy was, and which happened, a few weeks before the election.
Not even, it was it was a week.
Right. So at that point, something that had never occurred to me as a Northeast liberal, but certainly occurred to them, that Christie was done with the base, and it wasn't because of Bridgegate, which came later. It wasn't because of all the things that you mentioned, whether it was the Muslim judge or the DACA college tuition.
Yeah.
It was simply because he and Obama had gone on this tour of the Jersey Shore and I think played darts or something at the Jersey Shore.
Right.
and they seem to be cozying up to each other, and Republicans truly believe that cost Romney the election, which I completely and profoundly disagree with. But do you think that was really the beginning of the end for Chris Christie with the Republican base?
I think it definitely damaged to him. I traveled the country with him after that, and it would get brought up, and he had a good answer for it. Something of a bipartisan answer, but a good answer for it. And then he would, insult Obama about other stuff. But after that, more than a year after that, the polls still showed either him or Jeb as the front runner for the Republican nomination. So I'm sure it would have dogged him if he had been more successful in the primaries as the primaries went on. But it didn't really come up that again, really, because he was never enough of a player in the primaries. So I don't think it was a problem, but I don't think that's why he did so poorly in the Republican primaries.
Why was it?
He had no space because of Trump. And his shtick did not seem like fresh and new, and it was a very crowded field, and there was this whiff of corruption, even if people did not necessarily buy I think the Bridgegate thing was so bad. That stuff got a ton of coverage. There were other stories that went on about David Sampson, his
appointee to the Port Authority.
Appointee to the Port Authority, who got himself a flight to his vacation home by shaking down United Airlines, and that didn't get a ton of coverage, but for a few days it was a big story. There was this drumbeat that this Jersey guy was dirty, and then he didn't have this kind of angle to run on because of Trump.
Well, I want to know when you were messengered the dead to me thing from Chris Christie, because that is just the ideal, perfect Mean Girls, but also perfect mob move.
Yes.
It's a nice combination.
So my book about him came out in January 2016. I'm still on the campaign trail with him. He's still answering my questions while I'm following him out of a diner or whatever. I wasn't otherwise talking to him, but I didn't know if he had read the book. I didn't know anything. I didn't hear from his people what he thought. And then February comes around and he loses the New Hampshire primary. And then he licks his wounds and, comes back to Jersey. And I start going to normal Chris Christie press conferences in New Jersey. And he doesn't, one goes by, two goes by, he doesn't call on me. He doesn't and then I realized he's not even calling on anybody in my section. He was just avoiding even making any sort of eye contact with me whatsoever. And I'm not really sure what's going on. And then April comes around and I run into one of his people in the State House in Trenton. And he says, "Oh, Matt, the governor asked me to tell you, tell Matt Katz he's dead to me."
Oh, he passed you a note in City Hall. It wasn't even that he told you directly.
It was via messenger. Did not tell me directly. And I have not spoken to him since. It was 2.5 years ago. Well, and I don't know why, and nobody seems to know why. I mean, the book was,
I read that book. You devoted a lot of time to Bridgegate. I think it's a topic he probably doesn't want to dwell on.
Yes.
Which brings me to my next question, which is that he's somebody who, as you said, had a taint of corruption about him, whether fairly or not. But here he is potentially in line to be the next attorney general. And I keep hearing from a lot of Republicans that there's a good possibility that he could be the nominee.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
I mean, he's never charged with anything, and we have a short attention span in this country, and he was a former federal prosecutor, so he sort of has the right resume to do this kind of thing. He got his Bridgegate lawyer appointed as the FBI director. Chris Wray was Christie's secret Bridgegate lawyer, which none of us who followed the trial were aware of until later.
He's the one that had Christie's personal cell phone, right, with all the text messages that were never turned over.
Might still have it. We don't know where it is.
Know.
I don't understand with Kushner, though. How does...
Well, that's the problem, right?
That's the problem. That was why he didn't get the gig in the first place. That was also why he might not have become the vice presidential nominee.
Yeah, for those who don't know, Christie, when he was U.S. Attorney in New Jersey, prosecuted Charlie Kushner, who was Jared Kushner's father, for a variety of very bizarre crimes that we can get into another day. And it seems like the Kushners have not forgotten.
Right.
That Christie had done that. And so I'm curious as to whether that has been patched up. Also, a little known fact for a lot of people is that Bill Stepien, the White House political director, who I believe now has been deployed to the 2020 campaign, but Bill Stepien, or is about to be, was Christie's, one of his fall guys for Bridgegate, I think, one of the people that Christie fired.
He was one of the basically three people. Yeah, he fired right after Bridgegate.
And now he's a top guy at the White House, and I'm curious as to what Bill Stepien's reaction would be if Christie were to suddenly get appointed as Attorney General.
Chris Christie had at his last Christmas party as governor, which would have been last Christmas, a year ago, invited Bill Stepien. And Bill Stepien came. So I think that relationship has been patched up.
Patched up. Smart of Chris Christie to do,
Exactly
and
right.
very generous of Bill Stepien to accept.
And
not the Bill Stepien that we all knew,
No,
but
it's
that's
interesting.
yeah.
Huh? And supposedly him and Jared have something of a working relationship. Not to say that they wouldn't stab each other in the back if given the opportunity, but they've apparently somewhat reconciled, at least enough to be in the same room together. Whether Jared would allow Christie to elevate to Attorney General, and whether Jared still has the juice in order to block such a nomination is to be seen. I think we'll know a lot in January when Chris Christie's book comes out.
True.
Because that will, how he treats Jared in that book, what he says about the Trump orbit in that book will be a telling indication of whether or not he has a shot at becoming Attorney General.
This game that we play called Two Truths and a Lie, we try to guess your lie.
Yeah.
We both try to outsmart you. So you're two against one.
All right, I got three things.
All right, go ahead.
I prepared them.
All right, go.
Number one, I have multiple tattoos.
Okay.
Number two, I was born with a different last name than Katz. That's my last name now. Number three, when I was 17, I voted in the 1996 presidential election.
Wow. I'm going to say number three because you somehow are admitting to committing voter fraud, and you're exactly the poster child that Republicans have been railing about. So I hope that's true. So I'm going to go say number three, although I think it might be number one.
Do you know the statute of limitations on the?
I don't know. I don't know about that. But if Jeff Sessions is listening, I hope it's more than 20 years ago, whatever it is.
I think Jeff Sessions listens to the podcast.
I don't know if Jeff Sessions listens to this podcast. I'm not sure. I think if Chris Christie becomes Attorney General, he might listen to this podcast for reasons we probably neither of us wants. But
Right.
Emily, go ahead.
Tattoos.
So you're saying three is false.
I'm saying three is false. She's saying one is false.
One is false. Three is false. I did
knew
not
it.
commit voter fraud.
You what?
I did not commit voter
okay.
fraud. I
All
have
right.
2 tattoos.
Really? What are they?
I have one of my daughter's name on my biceps in the style of the flag at the top of the New York Times, because I was in newspapers at the time. And then I was in radio when my son was born, so I have a radio tower with my son's name on my arm. So when I said multiple tattoos, it's just two.
Just two.
I did not always want a tattoo, but then eventually, and then as soon I did just want a tattoo, and then I had to come up with an idea. So I'm like, it makes sense.
Did you tell your
to
mom?
put-
Did you tell your parents?
Yeah, my mother, the first thing she said was, "How much did that cost?"
Oh, really?
That was her way of saying she disapproved, I think.
If I ever came home with a tattoo at the age of 45, not
Yeah.
that I would, but if I ever did, I would totally get disowned by my parents. It wouldn't even be a question.
You would get what?
I would
Disowned?
get disowned.
Why?
I think it's the one non-negotiable.
It's
No tattoos.
It is not kosher. That's a fable.
I don't think it's a kosher thing. I just think they would be horrified. And so I will never do that. But that's just my thing. Matt Katz, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Should I get a Saltier Politics tattoo?
You could get a Saltier
Absolutely.
Politics tattoo. We have a whole logo. We get a little salt shaker. Done. How about this? When this goes wide, you can get a Saltier Politics tattoo.
Great.
Mom and Dad, I will not get a Saltier Politics tattoo. Thank you so much for joining us. It was a great conversation. And we'll come back when Chris Christie becomes Attorney General
yeah.
and talk about that in much more detail. We'll trade good Chris Christie stories. We both got some.
Yeah, we do.
Emily can sit through them and be pained, which a lot of people have been. All right, thanks very
Thank
much.
you guys. Appreciate it.
Well, that was a fantastic interview with Matt Katz. We learned a lot about everything from sex columns to immigration and Chris Christie, which will definitely be a follow-up in the coming months. But let's get into what's making us salty this week. What's making me salty is exactly what we talked about, immigration, and how the Trump administration is using a lot of rhetoric calling them illegals because no one's humanity is illegal, to dehumanize a group of people who are simply looking and working for a better life. You don't leave your culture, you don't leave everything you know just for funsies and to mess up someone else's life. And Julie, I think you know firsthand, I don't think your parents left Russia too.
Yeah, we weren't leaving Russia so we could go and, have access to Disney World every day. We left Russia for the same reason these refugees are fleeing South America, Central America right now, which is that they are actually fleeing for worse reasons than we did. We weren't fleeing for our lives. We were fleeing for the freedom to live our faith and our political beliefs the way we wanted to, but they're literally fleeing for their lives. I mean, I was a refugee, but I don't think my parents were worried about my getting raped or killed at the age of 6 if I were living in Moscow. A lot of these parents are fleeing their countries because they're seriously worried about their parents, their children, and themselves being raped or killed. And to dehumanize them this way, to greet them at the border with tens of thousands potentially American military greeting them at the border is a horrible use of our military. Again, these are not the White Walkers storming the wall. These are real people who are doing everything by the book, which is they're presenting themselves at the border and asking for asylum, which is exactly what our laws dictate they do. Chances are they will not get asylum, and chances are they will have to go back to either Mexico or to their home countries where they will face persecution and potential death. So let's all take a step back and stop dehumanizing and using them as a political football, because that's awful. What's making me salty this week is Mike Pence and his use of a quote-unquote rabbi to mourn the 11 Jewish victims who were killed in the Tree of Life synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh this week. This sort of so-called rabbi, who was actually defrocked by his own ministry, is a messianic rabbi, which is a sect of the Jews for Jesus. And as I said in our Salty Politics video, you really can't be a Jew for Jesus. If you're a Jew for Jesus, you're a Christian, which is great. You're more than welcome to be one. The Christian religion is a beautiful religion. It's not a judgment on any religion at all, other than to say that maybe there's a better way for Mike Pence to honor Jewish victims than to have somebody who believes that Jews will go to hell if they don't convert to Christianity or don't accept Jesus Christ as the Messiah, which is exactly the opposite of Jewish doctrine. Jewish doctrine believes that the Messiah has not yet arrived. That's what makes Jews different from Christians who believe the Messiah has arrived. So I'm a little salty that Mike Pence couldn't find one real rabbi who subscribes to the Jewish faith, any segment of the Jewish faith. It doesn't have to be an Orthodox one, doesn't have to be a Reconstructionist one, but somebody who probably doesn't believe that Jews are going to go to hell because they don't accept Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. That might have been a nice touch from Mike Pence in this time of national reconciliation.
I have to say a woman to that one.
Yeah, okay. All right, everybody, thank you so much for listening. We'll see you again next week on the Saltier Politics podcast.